Oh, hey, it's me, the feed scoop that's at the bottom of the barrel just before you put in 200 pounds of fresh feed. And now you're like, do I dig for it or do I have to go buy another scoop? Lindsay LaBella. And today we're going to talk about fat pasture pets. Well, okay, we're going to talk about when does the fat pasture pet actually have a medical problem? What's it called? How do you diagnose it? Once you have a diagnosis, how are you supposed to feed it? We're going to bring in a professional to answer all of these questions for you. Why? Because you're listening to Rochester Trail Riders. I'm excited to have with us today Dr. Cubitt, a powerhouse of the world of equine nutrition. Originally from Queensland, Australia, Dr. Cubitt has turned her passion for horses into a remarkable career, helping them thrive through the power of science-based nutrition. Dr. Cubitt holds an impressive academic background with degrees from the University of Queensland, complemented by a PhD from right here in the United States at Virginia Tech. As a co-founder of Performance Horse Nutrition, she has established herself as a renowned advisor and speaker, transforming complex nutritional science into actionable strategies for the average horse owner. Today, we're going to zone in on a topic that has challenged many, the nutritional challenges for horses diagnosed with Equine Metabolic Syndrome, or EMS. It's a complex issue, but don't worry, Dr. Cubitt's here to break it down for us, share her insights, and offer some practical tips on managing EMS through diet and nutrition. Dr. Cubitt, welcome, and thank you for joining us today.
Thank you so much for having me. I am excited to be here.
I love it.
And I'm really excited that spring is coming.
Yeah, it's not fair. We were just discussing how you've got daffodils coming up, and I have a snowstorm outside right now, so cheater.
Oh, yeah. The one thing that I have never gotten used to since moving to America, and I moved here in 2001, so it wasn't yesterday, is the smell of skunks. But the only thing a skunk tells me is that spring is coming. So I will tolerate that disgusting smell
Well,
because it means spring is coming.
do you know what other names that we tend to call skunks around here?
No.
We call them either the black and white kitty or my personal favorite, fart squirrels.
Oh gosh, I'm going to tell my kids that. They will love it.
There you go. There's my, United States 2 bits American humor for you. But you have spring grasses coming up, and I have a couple of people that I've been talking to in our community. Their horses have been recently diagnosed with EMS, and it's winter. And which is
Yeah.
crazy already, the fact that they're having problems with this disease. And for those that might not be familiar, do you want to give us a little overview on what EMS is and what we can look out for as a horse owner that might trigger us to say, hey, I need to call a vet?
Absolutely. So, equine metabolic syndrome kind of encompasses multiple different disorders, really starts with obesity being one of the symptoms, and then that can then lead to insulin resistance, can lead to having that cresty neck, kind of the regionalized adiposity. That can then lead to laminitis. Cushing's sometimes gets thrown in there. It's actually a separate disorder. You can have equine metabolic syndrome and not have Cushing's disease. And so, whilst you do feed the horse with Cushing's or PPID the same way, so if you're listening to this and you think, well, my horse isn't fat and it doesn't have a crusty neck, but it has been diagnosed with PPID, or as we generically call it, Cushing's disease, then you can use the same feeding and management recommendations, but they do actually stand alone. So that's kind of a pretty broad and basic overview of equine metabolic syndrome. For most horses, though, it starts with obesity.
So the person that triggered me to thinking and switching to this topic is the fact that she had a low thyroid issue, was managing it just fine, and then poof, out of nowhere, she came out one day, her horse is four-legged lame. And so that's what started this whole entire thing. And we were thinking, oh my gosh, maybe it's like a winter laminitis thing. And nope, it turned out to be EMS. But what are some things that your veterinarian's going to do? Like, how do we diagnose EMS and what are we targeting through a diet?
So your veterinarian is certainly going to look at characteristics of your horse, outward signs. They're going to look at their overall body condition. They're going to look at the condition of the neck, which we call the crest, and the cresty neck score. And then they're also going to be able to take certain blood parameters and based on those blood tests, be able to evaluate whether, insulin is high or glucose is high. And if we get all the way deep into that. Kind of the most easy way to describe to people why your veterinarian would look at glucose or insulin in the bloodstream is when you eat food or your horse eats food, it gets broken down into the stomach into different, proteins or fats. Carbohydrates get broken down into their most simple form, your sugars and starches, right? And then sugar being a simple, glucose being the simplest sugar, is going to get absorbed out of the stomach into the bloodstream. But the bloodstream is just like a superhighway. The bloodstream is like any highway in our community. And we need to get that glucose out of the bloodstream and into the cell in order for it to have its effect, be the fuel for that cell. Insulin, that's where insulin comes along. Insulin is the driver to push glucose out of the cell, out of the bloodstream and into the cell. And with a horse with equine metabolic syndrome that has insulin resistance, that insulin function is broken. They still create insulin. So it's not like type 1 diabetes where your pancreas no longer creates insulin. They still create insulin, but it just can't do its job. So when your veterinarian comes and takes a blood test and says, "Oh, your horse's glucose and insulin values are very high," it's because glucose isn't going anywhere. It's not being driven out of the bloodstream into the cell, and insulin is not able to do its job. So it's still being created. And so and research and a lot of there's lots of different theories of what's actually happening when it comes to laminitis or some of these different issues that occur with equine metabolic syndrome. But I think one of the general themes is this high level of glucose and insulin that floats around in the blood is actually damaging. It causes inflammation, and we do not want that to happen. So then your next question was about feeding management. And I think anybody who has heard the word insulin resistance, equine metabolic syndrome, crusty neck, laminitis, any of those, knows we need to feed a low sugar and starch diet.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe they said low carb, and I've tried to correct people to say, actually, let's talk about low sugar and starch versus carb, because carbohydrates actually include fiber, and your horse will die if it doesn't eat fiber. So that's just a little soapbox that I get on. So we talk about low sugars and starches, and why do we do that? Because we know that if you feed a lot of sugars and starches, that's going to make a lot of glucose in that bloodstream that we know this horse cannot get rid of. So if we keep the sugars low in the diet, then we decrease that issue of having a lot of glucose that goes nowhere.
So
if that makes sense.
It does. Before we jump into processed foods that we can buy at our food store, the number one intake that a horse has is hay. We need to understand what is in our hay to do that. And I'm going to go off a little tangent for those that are local, because we are talking for our Rochester area. If you need to get your hay tested, you can do that through the Cornell Cooperative Extension. And our local rep is Estes at Joe Glenn Farm. So I'll put links into there. You can put, so you guys can go and get your hay tested if you want. If you have the ability, you and I are talking right now, I can share a hay analysis with you of what the hay looks like in our region, if that will give you any.
Well, you're more than welcome to share yours. I'm lucky enough that I work with a feed company in New England, and they have their own forage testing lab. And one of the benefits to that is that annually we can kind of track hay trends and forage trends. And what I have seen in New England is that the nutritional value. I never like to use the word quality, because to me, bad quality is dirt, dust, rats, weeds, whatever shouldn't be in it. That is bad quality, and good quality is actually what's appropriate for your horse. But if we switch and we start to talk about nutritional value, what I've seen is the nutritional value of local Northeastern hays has gone down, down, down. But last year, randomly, the sugar and starch content went way, way up. And I can't give you an answer as to why. I know in my area here in Virginia, we had a huge drought last year. And so that concentrated the sugars and starches, and that was the explanation for us. But in the Northeast, it didn't stop raining.
It just rained all the
time. I
don't
know why there was high sugars in, but we do know that was the trend that we saw in 2023. So any hay that you were actually able to get off those fields before they were flooded, yeah, they were higher in sugars and starches. But things like protein and calorie content have slowly been going down. When I first started working in the Northeast, an average or lower quality protein content would have been 8 to 10. And now you're like, oh, this is great. If I've got a hay that's got 8 to 10% protein, crude protein, this is good. Now we're seeing some averages anywhere between 4 and 6% crude protein on a local
Ooh,
kind of meadow grass hay.
yeah. The one I'm looking right now is at about a 9 to 10% for protein,
Nice.
which is great. I love it. But I know
Yep.
we're always talking about, was it NSCs is what we need to calculate from this?
So the things that I look at when I look at hay and I evaluate, is this going to be good or bad? I obviously do look at carbohydrates or the sugar and starch content, but I also look at the other carbohydrate, which is fiber. So I look first at crude protein. I will look at the digestible energy value, and I know and digestible energy is a calculated value versus something like protein or zinc or copper. We actually analyze that, but I will look at the calorie content because that's going to tell us, how fat your horse might get or not get on it. Then I'll look at the fiber fractions, which is ADF and NDF, acid detergent fiber and neutral detergent fiber, and really they are a measure of palatability and digestibility. So if the ADF number goes up, the digestibility goes down. If NDF goes up, the palatability goes down. Now, one might say, oh, well, I don't want that. Well, if you have a fat pony that gorges its food as soon as it sees it, maybe a little higher ADF and NDF wouldn't be a bad thing. But if you have a lactating brood mare that needs every, bit of nutrition she can get out of every mouthful, we want to make sure those numbers are actually lower. So I look at those. And then when it comes to the sugar and starch fraction, we look at it used to be non-structural carbohydrates, which is
Right.
the NSC. But if you break that down a little further, you actually get multiple components. There's three numbers within that. There's WSC, water soluble carbohydrates, plus starch
Mhm.
equals non-structural carbohydrates. But you can break that WSC down even
Oh,
further into ethanol soluble carbohydrates, which is ESC, straight up simple sugars, which you would get from things like corn or oats or barley, like straight sugar like that, and then fructan. So fructan is a rapidly fermentable carbohydrate that's usually digested very quickly in the large intestine, but we get that in cool season grasses. And a lot of the research has shown that fructan has a huge component in the kind of development of laminitis and things like that. So there is one train of thought if you want to Google and go down a rabbit hole and get yourself completely lost, then there's a little line that says, well, fructans are non-digestible by the horse, and so we don't need to worry about fructans. I'm still in the camp that believes that we do need to worry about fructans, because if I again go out on a huge tangent, horses can't digest fiber anyway. The bugs that live in the horse's gut, they digest fiber, and the bugs that live in the horse's gut can digest fructan. So again, that's my little side note.
and once it's digested,
Um,
it's easily, transmitted through the, intestinal tract.
yes. So, because that's for me my passion and what I am most interested in is the microbiome, the bugs that live in the hindgut. They are another organ. They're so, so important, and they themselves digest, communicate with the brain, do so many things. Whole nother podcast.
So a lot of times, like if you are sitting on there and you're talking to your hay analysis, you're talking to your vet, they always sit there and give you, well, you add the WSC plus your starch, which gives you a number. If it's higher or lower than
Hmm.
usually, was it 10 or 12, then
10.
you're going to need to soak it.
Yeah.
What is the total number that we're looking for hay plus feed per day, I guess, in a percentage wise?
So it really depends on where your horse is at in its journey. Okay. Do we know that this is a pony and we're just being proactive He's a little overweight. I haven't been able to control that. He doesn't get a lot of exercise. I'm worried he's got a bit of a crusty neck. He hasn't been diagnosed with equine metabolic syndrome yet, but I don't want him to. Then he's in my kind of at risk category, but not currently sick. And so I would be looking to keep his total diet 12% or less.
That includes hay plus
Um,
feed. Okay.
yes. Total diet 12% or less. If your horse is currently actively sick, has laminitis, has other issues that we're actively treating, then 10% or less is the number that we're looking at. And that is total diet, right? So this is where a lot of folks can get caught up, get a little confused. The biggest thing you feed, the largest portion of your horse's diet is the
Mm-hmm.
hay, right? And so they'll come to me and say, well, I can't, a ration balancer, for example, 1 pound a day, generic. Many companies have a ration balancer that you feed 1 pound a day. Typical feed for a fat horse. But if the sugars and starches in that 1 pound, the non-structural carbohydrate value on a lot of ration balances may be 15 to 20%. And they'll say to me, oh, I can't feed that. The internet and my vet said less than 10%. And I just said less than 10%. But it's 1 pound, right? And then I turn around and say, have you had your hay tested? No, didn't know I could do that. Well, that same horse is eating anywhere from 15 to 20, maybe even 25 pounds of hay. If we go back to high school and do some basic math,
Yeah.
even a pound, 100, if that 1 pound of ration balancer was 100% sugar,
Percentage wise over
so
the whole.
percentage-wise, I always say you got to be careful. You have a percent means nothing unless it's attached to a number. And my joke when I give presentations is, I will give you 100% or 1%. Which one do you want? And most people say, oh, 100%. And then I say, well, I'll give you 100% of my salary or 1% of Bill Gates's salary. Now, which one do you want? I guarantee you want 1% of Bill Gates's and not 100% of mine. So we need to take a step back and look at the whole thing. It's like also if we're feeding a supplement and 2 ounces a day and they're calling me saying, well, what's the sugar and starch content? It's 2 ounces a day and it's 1,000-pound horse. It really doesn't matter. Focus on your hay.
So
Focus on your hay. You mentioned the soaking.
does that actually work?
That
Or if
oh,
you have a hay that's sitting at 12%, you want to be under 10, should I go look for another hay supplier or should I work on soaking my hay instead?
Oh, there's so many answers there. There's so many answers, and some of them come down to where you live and the fact that it's still freezing outside. And who really wants to soak their hay in the middle of winter when it's freezing and you don't have hot water in your barn? I mean, so the thing that I usually do is, okay, we start out with the hay. A lot of times there is no choice. This is just the hay that I have, right? And so I think that also some people get a bit nervous when I say do a hay test. They're like, well, I can't change the hay. Why would I do a hay test? Because it's a good place to start. That's the base. I know you can't change it. I know you've been buying from the same guy for the last 50 years and he has great prizes and he delivers it and he stacks it and it's wonderful. But knowing the baseline is good. And year to year, even though he cuts it from the exact same fields, the nutritional value and the carbohydrate value is going to change. So we get that hay test, and let's say the hay was 12%, but we have a sick horse. I'm going to say soak it and you'll get it below 10% easily. Let's say it was 16 or 17% though to start with. I'm not so sure. I'm not so sure. And so what we will do is we'll do a little bit of scientific experiment and I'll say, okay, soak the hay for an hour, drain the water out, freeze it, and that stops that reaction occurring. And then I'll get you to send it in at that point. It's what we do with pasture as well. If you ever do a pasture sample, when you cut it, you want to freeze it immediately. So, and then we would see, okay, were we able to leach out enough sugars and starches to get to below 10%? Sometimes the customer will say, or the client will say, look, I just don't have the ability to soak hay. So at that point, then we can do multiple things. We can say, okay, we're going to use a small amount of this hay, but then we're also going to either, number one, find another hay that has a lower sugar and starch value that when we combine the two of them, we do get below
Hmm.
10%. or we're going to use a bagged forage product that we know comes with a guarantee, and that guarantee means bag to bag to bag. It's going to be identical, and it's, the company is selling it to me with a guarantee that it's going to be less than 10%. I don't love to add 100% pelleted or cubed forage. I like to have the majority as long stem hay, but you get to a point where it's like, what actually is going to work?
And then you have the
So
complication of horses are herd animals. You have one horse in a herd that
yes,
needs,
and how do you
yeah,
do
how
it?
do you manage that, which is its own.
And I would say that if finances were no option, which that's a dumb statement to even say because they always are. It doesn't even matter if somebody comes to you and says, well, finances are no option. It always is. If you have a herd, it's unless you had one horse in the herd that was going to be, a very high performing athlete or was super skinny and needed a bunch of calories, we always say you're going to have to take those off. But if you have your equine metabolic syndrome horse in a herd with others that are all still pretty easy keepers, but maybe haven't been diagnosed, feeding them a low calorie, low carb diet isn't going to hurt them. Feeding a high carb diet will hurt your horse. So where possible, I like to group herds similarly, where possible, if you get
I
my drift.
totally get it. And
Yeah,
the good news is
where
the majority of the
possible
horses around here are a little chunky.
are easy
Yes.
keepers. Yeah,
It's
yes,
rare to get the hard keeper versus the easy keeper. You mentioned that you have spring grass coming up and
yeah, I
dandelions.
do.
And I know you and I just met, but I am your proponent of horses are not meant to be on grass and to do everything possible to get them off it. We do track systems around here. I don't know if you do the paddock paradise kind of horse track systems, but we got a lot of people in our area that are into it. I've had mine for over 10 years where I let them move and roam and they are on dirt and I feed hay
Yeah.
24/7, 365. So
I mean, I would backtrack a little bit and I would say that there's a lot of things that horses do nowadays that they were never designed to do. And horses are grazing animals. Straight up, they're grazing animals, and they were meant to always graze grass. We have created grass that is, but okay, let's go back to the wild horse, for example. And the wild horse grazed a wide variety of grasses and forbs and legumes and things that we considered weeds. And they were all warm, mostly warm season, local. But horses also moved. They moved long distances. So they never put a lot of grazing pressure in one area. Or if they did, then they moved on and that was able to
mhm.
regrow. We put horses in smaller, confined areas. And when you use those more local, warm season grasses, or even just your local grasses, they may not have to be warm season grasses. Those grasses are what we call clumping, and they don't spread out. And so when the horse nips at them, it just rips it out of the ground. So those grasses do not withstand grazing pressure. So what we did as agronomists is we created grasses that were stronger. They could withstand grazing pressure, they could withstand trampling and hoof pressure. And what makes anything strong?
Yep,
Energy.
sugar.
What makes energy in a grass is sugar, right? And so we also do less exercise with our horses. We don't allow horses to have seasonal fluctuations in weight. So we have created kind of the perfect storm. So I wouldn't go as far as to say horses shouldn't eat grass. Horses should exercise more. Some horses shouldn't have access to really high sugar grasses. And so, how we get around the fact that we do have to confine horses in small spaces, we don't have kind of 45 acres for one horse to go and graze and roam, is we have to then change our management strategies to the track-like systems
Yep.
or to dry lot systems. Is that is that the perfect world? The
No.
perfect world would be that I had local grasses and I allowed my horses to graze and they exercised enough and their weight fluctuated and everything was fine. But the track system and the dry lot system, really where it started from, the track allows you to get the exercise as well that
Yep.
confined spaces didn't allow you to get, kind of meets the needs of how we manage the horses today. So that's what I say on that.
All right. So moving on from grasses and from hay analysis. Our hay analysis is showing that we are deficient in some areas. We do need to feed a concentrate
Mm.
feed of some sort. What is the best things to look for when you're shopping for a feed or even just a supplement? Or do you do both, or what
Mhm.
should we think about
And I
there?
love the word you use there. I love that you use the word concentrate, and because so many people use the word grain synonymously with what you feed a horse. And grain to me is cereal grain. Corn, oats, barley are
Yep.
grains, right? And we do have a lot of concentrates, which is something that comes in a bag that have none of those cereal grains in there or have such a small quantity that they're not really contributing to the sugar and starch. Maybe they're contributing to binding or protein, something like that. But I try to use the word concentrate. So I'm glad that you use that. Hays and pastures, copper, zinc, selenium are always going to be deficient, right? Doesn't, most people familiar with selenium, unless you live in the Dakotas, the soil is going to be deficient in selenium, but it's also going to be deficient in copper and zinc. Depending on what you do with your horse, you may get plenty of protein and calories out of your hay or pasture, but your zinc, copper, and selenium definitely we believe be deficient. What I'm noticing in the Northeast more and more is also a deficiency in phosphorus in the hay.
Hmm.
That I'm having to work really hard to balance phosphorus in the diet, and that comes from the fact that environmentally we are not adding phosphorus to fertilizer because then it gets into the water stream and it's like
Blue
a
algae.
pollutant. So yeah, so phosphorus is another thing that I've had to kind of finagle a little bit. Most of the horses that we are discussing or that your listeners will have probably on a ration balancer, very low intake, highly concentrated with those nutrients because you're only feeding 1 pound a day. Because what you're not getting out of it is the calories. When we design feeds, the more energy you have to provide a horse, the more actual pounds you'll have to feed. So you'll notice a racehorse feed is fed at, anywhere from 8 to 12 pounds a day.
Hmm.
A easy keeper, we're looking at 1 pound a day. And that's based on calories, that energy. I don't need to get any energy into my easy keeper. So I can concentrate all the copper, zinc, selenium, protein all down into 1 pound. Because I'm not having to dilute it to get a bunch of calories into that feed as well. So your ration balancer across the board is your best friend for a lot of these horses. That's going to be it can be the most convenient way to add a little additional protein because as we've mentioned, sometimes the quality, the nutritional value is lower and we're not getting enough protein. Also, as some of these disorders progress, one of the issues is muscle wasting. And so we're trying to combat that with good quality protein. So your ration balance is going to offer you that good quality protein. It's going to have your vitamins and minerals your horse needs as long as you're feeding that 1 pound a day, or some of them may be balanced to 2 pounds a day without all the extra calories. Now, don't be concerned when you read the label and think, oh my gosh, it's 25% crude protein. I can't feed that. That's 1 pound a day. And if we go back to what is a quarter
Yep.
of a pound, it's 4 ounces. That's not a lot of protein for a horse, right? So, same thing with sugars and starches. If you look at a lot of them, might run 16, even 20% non structural carbohydrates. It's 1 pound a day, right? So 16 to 20% of 1 pound, the actual amount of sugars and starches is very, very low. So,
And
um,
actually, that probably is a good point for people because folks love their supplements. And a lot of, they want to add extra things on. And those supplements, they do come with their own sugars and calories and everything in there as well to
yeah.
make them palatable. And so is
Hmm.
that something they should be concerned with, to pay attention to, just don't care?
Depends. If you're like a real happy camper and adding, then of course all of those are going to add up. If they all have a little bit of sugar, it's all going to add up. If you're adding an electrolyte, now I prefer an electrolyte that doesn't have sugar in it for other reasons, but if your electrolyte has a little bit of sugar in it for palatability and you're feeding 2 ounces of your electrolyte and it's got a small amount of sugar in it, that doesn't matter. It really doesn't matter in the grand scheme of things. You're going to get way more sugar out of your hay that's got 5% non structural carbohydrates than you're getting out of your 2 ounces of electrolyte that has a sprinkling of sugar in it. So sometimes you can just turn yourself inside out trying so hard to do the right thing that it becomes so impractical. And again, off on a little tangent, one thing that I always have over the last couple of years have been asking my clients is the first question you have to ask yourself when managing or feeding horses is, why do you have the horse to start with? Why do you
Hmm.
own a horse? And maybe it's, I work really hard. I wasn't able to have a pony when I was a child, and now I've got a good job, and I just want to have a horse. I want to go trail riding on the weekend. I want to enjoy owning a horse. Would you enjoy it if it took you 3 hours to mix its feed, and managing it was a nightmare, and, you just turned yourself inside out, making every purchase for the horse because you just were trying so hard to get it right, that you sit down at night, every night, with so much anxiety. You're like, "I know I'm not doing anything right, and I'm reading another Facebook post, and they said I shouldn't do this, but I should be doing this, and I should be buying that." And then you're like, I'm not enjoying this. I'm spending all my money and I'm not enjoying this. So we need to always remember, why do we have this creature in the first place? Let's keep it simple and get out of it what I wanted. All right. Manage him as simply as possible.
So,
Love him, brush him, walk him, do all those fun things, and don't get totally bent out of shape with feeding him.
all right, fine.
Even though I'm a nutritionist, I'm like,
Now I want to spoil my pony. Are there treats that I should
yes.
avoid, ones that I should use? Maybe I am into trick training and want a pocket of something. What recommendations do you have for working with ponies that shouldn't have all that extra?
If you've got an actively sick horse and you're really trying to keep all of the sugar down, then no, I wouldn't say use carrots or anything like that. Alfalfa cubes or a little handful of alfalfa pellets can be a good treat as well. Um, I think if you go, again, I can't keep up with everything that's available, but I do know that there are a lot of people that sell low carb horse treats. Maybe you have to find a few different ones to see what your horse actually is going to be motivated by, because I know that there's a lot of low carb, kind of low sugar treat options on the market for us that I'm like, That's not motivating me to do anything. That is not motivating me to do anything." But also know that nutrition is not the only thing that we're focusing on with this equine metabolic syndrome horse. If you exercise, just like yourself, if you're trying to be healthy, it's not just your diet. It is, are you doing other things to help? Are you exercising? Even if it's just walking, maybe you don't have enough time to be riding your horse a lot. Well, what about, I was working with a client at the end of last year, and her horse had lost a little bit of weight, and again, all she wanted to do was be around her horse and work with it. And I was like, well, why don't you, there's a beautiful paddock at the barn she bought it at. Why don't you hand walk the horse? There's a lot you can do on the ground exercises even, to improve that human animal bond. So I think that if you do some other management, exercise, that kind of thing, then things like treats, maybe you can be a little bit
More liberal.
less strict. But I always recommend alfalfa cubes.
Yeah,
They're simple and easy to get.
they're one of my favorites too are hay pellets, but the hay pellets seem to have more molasses in them to hold them together than the alfalfa does.
Some of them, but if you find one that doesn't, but again, it's a treat. And if you're using molasses as a binder in a pellet, it's actually quite a small amount. And so a little, you can see my hand. Your
Yep,
listeners can't see my hand, but you can see
just
my
a cup.
hand. A few little pellets that are going to be a treat. I don't think you'd even be able to weigh the amount of molasses that was in that.
You touched briefly on the fact that we want to keep these guys moving. All right,
Mhm.
inflammation's down, they're finally up, we're not showing active signs of laminitis again. What would you suggest for getting these guys back and moving? You mentioned hand walking. Is that daily? Should we do this 2 or 3 times a week, or just as we have the availability?
I managing feeding a horse is very easy. Managing the people that have the horses becomes more difficult. And I say that with the best, I'm not saying that negatively. We have jobs, we have, financial constraints. So I would say, "Oh, it'd be wonderful if you could hand walk your horse once or twice every single day." And they're like, "Well, I got to work. I got kids. I got my kids have soccer camp in the afternoon. What how's is that going to work?" So you have to find the happy medium. So again, you're not so overwhelmed, but it can fit into. And so if that means that 3 days a week is all you can manage, 3 days a week is better than no days a week. So whatever you can manage.
I always thought of EMS kind of like the type 2 diabetes, it's diet and exercise. And the same thing applies to our horses in my head. Is that kind of the same thing that I should be thinking of that
Yeah.
way?
It's diet and exercise. It's diet and exercise, yes. And you can't out exercise a bad diet, but so it's really a combination of the two. We really want to make sure. Now, it's easier for a lot of people to control the diet and exercise. When I start talking about exercise, then it starts to be, well, the time commitment, and maybe your horse is lame and you aren't able to. Maybe they're suffering from a little bout of laminitis or something, and so you have to be a little bit more cautious. But trying to exercise your horse. It doesn't necessarily mean riding it, hand walking it, lunging, 5 minutes, 10 minutes, once a week,
I get
3 times a week, whatever. Something is better than nothing.
I get laughed at by my neighbors because I hand walk my horses up and down my road like a dog, and sometimes with my dog. And the number of
I'm
times
sure it's great for you too.
the number of times they stop, roll down their window going, "You're supposed to be on it." Like, life is good.
Well, I mean, some people have miniature horses and they don't ride them. It's all about that human animal bond. And if you can't ride and you still want to build that bond, then that hand walking, I mean, talk to your horse. Your horse is therapy. You're talking to him, you're telling him all your secrets, whatever bad happened that day. After you have come back from being with your horse, you feel better.
To
So,
mention that little extra walk is not so bad for us either. It's like a
exactly.
2 for 1. You get to be with your horse and
Yeah.
get exercise.
And you get exercise. Yes. You didn't have to pay for it.
And I have been really enjoying our conversation. As we work on wrapping this one up, do you have any recommendations on, maybe some books or podcasts or any websites, anything that folks might wanna go to learn more about this or
Oh, there is so much stuff out there. And unfortunately, there's a lot of stuff that looks good that is terrible. I would say form a good relationship with your feed company, whoever you're working with, and your veterinarian. Ask questions. And a good feed company is going to be transparent and they're going to answer your questions honestly. If you don't feel like they're helping you long term, then, look around and find one that you feel like is listening to your what you want to get out of the relationship. University of Minnesota, if you do follow social media and you're on those platforms, then University of Minnesota has some has an excellent thing to follow. I can send you the link, you can share it with your
that'd be
listeners.
awesome.
Yeah, and they do free webinars. I know that they have a free webinar series coming up with veterinarians that are just talking about horse ownership or different disorders, but there's always free things. There's a lot of one thing that I caution people against, because there is a lot of information out there, is that your horse is unique. Horses, that's what we love about horses. Horses aren't like other livestock. Like if I have a herd of dairy cows, they have been genetically bred to be identical so that I can feed them all exactly the same. I can house them exactly the same, and they're all going to do the same thing. They're all going to produce the same amount of milk with the same amount of input. Horses are like people. Every single horse is different. So I know we want to ask our friends and we want to get on social media and say, hey, my horse has this problem. What should I do? Be careful doing that though, because nobody has your horse. Nobody has your financial situation, your management situation, your even your kind of beliefs in what you some people believe that they don't want to feed this or that. And so I think working directly with an expert, an actual equine nutritionist that has a PhD, or your veterinarian if they have, kind of focused or enjoy nutrition, that's a good place to start. Listening to podcasts like this that have experts on that are going to kind of point you in direction of good resources. But look, I do it myself too. My kid has some kind of allergy on its skin, and immediately I go to Google and what's going on? What's going on? But you got to be careful doing that because not everybody else's situation is going to match yours, and then I think you just bury yourself in
Big
anxiety,
spiral.
worrying about what you've done wrong, and it's a spiral then. Like anything, get a good veterinarian, get a good farrier, get a good, if you want to do body work with your horse, get a good body worker or whatever, and have a team and stick with your team. Trust your team. Trust that they're going to tell you the right thing. If you don't trust them, get somebody else on your team.
You've covered so much. And I think everything that you just went through hits on my last question, but I'll ask it anyways, which is, if you're a horse owner, this is your first time ever dealing with EMS, what is the one piece of advice you would like to give them from a nutritional standpoint?
Oh my gosh. One, there's so many. Work very closely with your veterinarian, right? Because there are we haven't even touched on the kind of medical therapies that are all going to be used in conjunction with nutrition and management. Don't get hyper focused on one particular thing. That would be my one caution or recommendation is you can get hyper focused on one particular supplement or one particular feed and forget about the hay or forget about exercising your horse. Take a step back, look at all the things, get your veterinarian work and okay, tell me all the things that I need to address here. When I'm going on a diet to lose weight, you know, I'm not just going to cut out butter. I'm going to exercise. I'm going to drink more. I'm going to make sure I sleep more. Like there's so many more things involved. Don't get overwhelmed. It can be scary. The repercussions of not handling it, not being proactive can be devastating. So I think that really scares people. But yeah, get a good team, listen, don't stress out. It'll be fine.
Thank you so much for taking time out today. I really appreciate it. Hopefully this helped a lot of our listeners in the local area to understand what's going on and how to prepare for it as we come into spring seasons and this starts flaring up for many, many people.
Yes.
Thank you very much. You have a great day.
Thank you. Bye.
I know that was a ton of information, and we only touched the tip of the iceberg when it comes to EMS and IR in your horses. There's so much more you can do for them through medications and supplementations. If you have any questions or concerns, or you're like, is my pony really that fat that it might be an issue? Talk to your vet. They know a lot more than Google and will be happy to help you out. And on a side note, just after I hung up the phone with Dr. Cubitt, I had a goat go into labor and gave me a little boy, little girl. And I contacted her and just let her know. I'm like, oh my gosh, this happened, because we were discussing all the fun, cool things that we do on our farm outside of horses. She loves her cows. I love my goats. And she suggested that I name them Sugar and Starch in honor of today's show. So welcome to the world, Sugar and Starch. And you can see some photos of the cute little goat kids in the show notes. Speaking of show notes, if you listen on like Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or an app like that, please leave me a star review, follow the show, write an actual review. It helps so much get the podcast out and in front of other folks so they also can get this cool information. Like, subscribe, share anywhere. Please, it helps. It really does, and it keeps me motivated doing this. And with that, we're going to wrap it up. So as always, respect the trail, wear a fashionable helmet, and leave no trace at your trailer site. Happy trails!